Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors, episode 138. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger, and I'm so glad that you could join me. As always, I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the wonderful listeners who continue to support this podcast via Podbean Patron, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. If you love the podcast and tune into every episode, perhaps you'd consider becoming a Talking Tudors patron. Just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, or click on the Be a Patron button on the Podbean app. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. December's prize is a Tudor Rose Collection candle package, sponsored by Clio Global. Clio's Tudor Rose candle recreates the aromas of the Tudor court. This month's Talking Tudors patron prize will feature a Tudor Rose candle, along with art prints of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn created by Clio partner Royalty Now. All patrons are also eligible to attend monthly Talking Tudors live talks, which take place on Zoom. These events are exclusive to patrons. At the end of December, I'll be chatting to Tracy Borman about her new book, Crown and Scepter, and much more. Please get in touch with me if you'd like to register for the event. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I would love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about the Reformation is Michelle Peterson Clark. Michelle has loved history since she was 10 years old, when her parents took her to London for the first time. At the age of 50, she realised her lifelong dream of studying history at the University of Oxford, undertaking a British and European Studies course first, which saw her the following year being accepted in a Masters in Early Modern History with Oriel College, Oxford. She graduated in July 2019. Her dissertation was on the continental context of the printing of the early English Bible, 1525 to 1540, which focused on the revolution in printing that was birthed from the Reformation sweeping Europe and England during Henry VIII's reign. Michelle is in the process of setting up her blog that will focus on history and travel, her two great loves. Savvy travel historian won't just post travel photos of historical places, but will also tell people about the history of the places she visits. Despite being delayed by 18 months because of COVID, Michelle and her family have returned to the UK and are now living in the village of Wallingford in South Oxfordshire and setting off on their next lot of adventures to travel and discover even more places than they did the last time they lived in the UK. Our conversation's coming straight up after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. welcome to Talking Tudors, Michelle. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to have you on the show. So let's just start by you introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about your background.
I've had a few career lives, worked for the state government and local government in South Australia for a number of years and did some consulting work. I'm a social planner by profession. So that's an urban planner, but someone that looks after people. So schools and, community services and public housing and stuff like that. And then we moved from Adelaide to Melbourne for my husband's business, and he runs an engineering business. And so I kind of did staffing and human resources and all of that for quite some time. In between raising 3 children, I've got 3 boys and 2 stepchildren. And then I got into, I've kind of always written things because I've got a few university degrees under my belt. And so I started doing marketing, writing blogs and, that sort of thing for business people that we knew. And all that sort of time I've been since I was about 10 years old. My parents took me to London. And so I've loved English history since then. And I've always in the back of my mind had this thing I'd really love to go and study at Oxford. But, I thought I'd missed the boat with that because I was a geographer. I wasn't a historian. And so we set a plan in 2010 and decided that we'd come and live in England for 6 months in 2017, and that turned into 12 months because I found a course that I could do at Oxford, applied and got into it. And at 50, I turned 50 that year. So in 2017, so we packed 8 suitcases, our 9-year-old, and headed off to England for a year. That turned into 2 because I subsequently got accepted into a master's in early modern history. And then I did my master's on the continental context of the printing of the early English Bible, 1520 to 1547, so during Henry's reign. And so that's how I reinvented myself, I guess, as a historian, although I do still do marketing stuff because when you're a writer, you write no matter what. So I'm sort of combining both and setting up a love of history and travel, sort of combining it into savvy travel historian, which is where I'm sort of at now.
Fantastic. What a varied and wonderful career. That's really great. Now, we are going to be talking a little bit about the Reformation. I actually think this is possibly the first episode I've done on it in many episodes. So I'm excited about this. So perhaps when people...
Which is really scary because you've had some really good people on who know a lot about the Reformation.
Well, there's so much to talk about, isn't there, that, you find that these things happen. But so when people hear about or hear the word Reformation, perhaps they think a little bit about Martin Luther and the nailing of his 95 Theses to the door at the church in Wittenberg. But is this really the case?
Well, it's certainly true that, it was this event that kicked off the vigorous debate and discussion around practices of the Catholic Church at the time. There's a debate about how much development of his ideas Luther did actually before that fateful day in October 1517. Certainly at the time, he did not think that his ideas were going to result in breaking away from the Catholic Church at all. Like his 95 Theses were really more of a discussion, sort of a starting point. And all the pictures you see of Luther have him nailing it to the door when in actual fact it was likely to be pasted because nails weren't invented then. So that's actually just a bit of a meme thing, I think, that we've come to know. But, he was seeking reform within the church, the current structure that it had, and he really didn't think it would be a new doctrine as to how it developed. There were rumblings in the Catholic Church at the time around the practices that they were undertaking, particularly with indulgences. And, for centuries, confessing of your sins and taking some form of payment for that was the way of life for the Catholics. Things like if you did good works or if you went on pilgrimage or, if you did charitable works, or if you didn't do good things, then you'd suffer in purgatory. And so at the time, there was a notion that if you died, your soul sat in purgatory until you had paid for all the sins that you've done. And I guess rich people started to think, well, they didn't like that idea because, how long were they going to sit there for? What about if I could pay someone to either go on pilgrimage for me or say prayers for me after I'm dead to speed up my journey into heaven so I could move out of purgatory? And certainly as early as the 11th century, people started sort of talking about that. And so the Catholic Church started to bring in this system where you could remit your sins. And it turned into, obviously, as we know, a big money spinner for them. And certainly in the 16th century, the payment of indulgences helped build St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. So, that gives you a bit of an idea, and lists as an idea about how much money was raised. But Luther was really uncomfortable with the idea that you had to pay for salvation in this way. And so initially, I think he just wanted, those questions and ideas to be discussion points. But we end up with the 16th century equivalent of all hell breaking loose, I guess you could say. But at the time, and certainly this was some of the things that I investigated in my master's thesis, was that, printing of pamphlets was starting to emerge in Europe. And Luther was an excellent marketer in this regard. He used this medium really effectively to distribute his theses. And, this meant that there were people far and wide could actually read what he was talking about. They didn't have to be in front of the church door at Wittenberg to know what was going on. And then it kind of ascended into the printing press being used by both sides during this time. Arguments for and against the ideas that formed the Reformation and the different smaller reformations that developed and went on. But certainly throughout the early stages of the English Reformation, Henry and most of the population were and remained quite conservative and committed to the traditional faith. But as Luther's works began to start to arrive in the 1520s, Henry was really quite against him and initiated a campaign using print largely from, and obviously from continental printers. We'll talk a little bit later about English printing presses were really quite backward, would be a good word, I think, to say at that stage. But there was a lot of conservative Catholics who, extended patronage and things like that. The nobility sort of set up people to have arguments for and against what the ideas of Luther were. And Henry, in fact, we know in 1521 was, Pope Leo X gave him the Defender of the Faith title because of his book that he wrote against Luther's heresies. I think that by the summer of 1518, other ideas were starting to sort of come out. We have Erasmus and his humanist ideals were being developed at universities all over Europe. But it was a fertile ground for young men to question what was happening around them, and print facilitated that. So many of the early reformers, they studied at Oxford and Cambridge, and they were exposed to humanist ideas and classical texts. And it was in this environment that they discussed Luther's ideas. And then certainly students at Cambridge, they had a very good group of people that had lots of discussions, and it was really a groundswell for reformists, by the mid sort of 1520s. But, obviously people were interested in the Bible long before Luther's ideas were published, and there were other people as well. In England, there were men such as William Tyndale and John Frith, Miles Coverdale in the early, 1520s. Luther was just one source of ideas that they were looking at the time. They were kind of looking at all sorts of different things. There's a gentleman called John Barnes, and he was probably the only one among Cambridge group that stayed closest to Luther's ideas. The others kind of all drifted off and moved into different parts. But that Cambridge group were really quite instrumental in looking at and studying Erasmus and discussing their concerns about the ecclesiastical abuses within the church at the time. But there was no cohesive evidence that at these early stages anyone was deeply dissatisfied at all with Catholic doctrine. So there's lots of different ideas, there's lots of talking, there's lots of developing of things on a range of topics, and print enabled Luther to be able to spread these ideas a bit further, and it kind of fueled what was to come. So there were many reformers and many others involved besides Luther, but obviously Luther's the famous one. Out of them, the most famous.
He is, and we're going to talk a little bit more as well about that fluidity, because I think that's quite interesting, and the role that printing played in a little bit. But I also wanted to ask you, so scholars such as Christopher Haig and George Bernard have written about the English or the King's Reformation, but is this idea changing now?
Well, the English Reformation's certainly often been told as a really Anglo-centric type story. Much of the historiography would have us believe that it was an act of state by Henry. Historians from the 60s like Dickens and Parker certainly thought this. But recent scholarship has argued that the English Reformation was much more continental in nature than what originally was suggested. So you've got Andrew Pettigrew or Dermot McCulloch who are advocating and discussing that. The rise of these reformist ideas was very much an international movement, and England was just a small part of a much larger story that unfolded beyond the 16th century. And events in England, I think, really need to not be interpreted in isolation from her European neighbours, because that just wasn't the case. From the early 1520s, you've got a number of English scholars and clergy. They travelled abroad and, came back to England back and forth quite often, and they became radicalised by reformist ideas while they were doing that. As you said before, movement was very fluid and enabled them to be exposed to different ideas, and then they would write their thoughts, and, that would develop over time. So, Tyndale, George Joy, William Royce, they were radicalised on the continent by going back and forth and by their travelling. And certainly, someone like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, he was influenced as well in the 1530s, and that shaped things like, the early development of Protestant ideas for the church. And he then wrote the Book of Common Prayer in 1549. So, his ideas were also shaped in the same way. As the years progressed, more reformers joined Tyndale and Joy on the continent, and the concentration in the Low Countries enabled this spread of Protestant ideas, and it was facilitated by the use of print, which was really quite active in Europe at the time. But it was a dangerous time for people, and, the Catholic authorities were wanting to stamp it out. They didn't want the reform movement to progress. But as the popularity in England increased, demand for literature about it also increased. And so that was like a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of thing, they didn't know very much, and then they read something about it, and then they wanted to know more. And so then more was printed about it. So there was that sort of situation going on as well. But, certainly Barnes and Coverdale particularly travelled back and forth quite a bit. But what they also did was they were intermediaries for Henry's court and for relaying information about what was going on in continental activities and other courts back to the king. And, Henry certainly heard about more groundswell about Luther and those sorts of things because people went back and forth and gave information. Henry was certainly influenced by other rulers in Europe by having these men going back and forth.
So let's talk a little bit more about the printing press, because you've mentioned printing a lot. So tell us a little bit more about the role it played in the success, I suppose, of the Reformation, and how did the continent influence this as well?
So in 1520, the print industry in England was in its really, really early stages, infancy. Caxton was almost the sole printer, and the methods used and the quality produced was just inferior, really inferior to that found on the continent. For a long time, there were craftsmen to operate the machines and things in England, all had to come from Europe. We didn't have anyone in England who was able to operate the presses and know about the printing process and those sorts of things. The English industry was heavily reliant on the developments and the skill of the craftsmen from Europe. There was nothing here. The machines, the type, the woodcuts, the ornaments, anyone involved in the industry and any tools used had to come from England. England didn't even have its own source of paper at the time. So there was a paper mill quite early on, or towards the end of the 15th century, but I think it closed down. And so they had to import all the paper. So when they did that, the authorities also knew how much paper was available. So as things started to heat up in terms of printing presses and stuff like that, if more and more paper suddenly came in, they knew that there was perhaps clandestine printing going on and those sorts of things. If printers were being hidden in backs of flower shops and things like that. But when it came to the first authorised copy of the the Bible in English, the one that Cromwell asked Coverdale to do. He turned to French printers to do it because the quality of what they wanted was not good enough, or the look and the feel, I guess. And in actual fact, the printers produced the first 2 copies of it on parchment paper. One was for Henry and one was for Cromwell, and then the rest were on normal paper. And then there's a whole story about how the French authorities, because they were quite Catholic, they had to stop printing them, and they confiscated the presses and the pages, and there was negotiations about getting it back, and ultimately everything was moved to England and it was printed there. But there was all that sort of stuff going on, but the English authorities really waged war with the continental printers in those days, and that started sort of with Wolsey as well. They wanted to stop the importation of religious books in English, Bibles and religious pamphlets. Many of them were Luther's works, and some of the other reformers. In 1524, we've got Cuthbert's Tunstall, the Bishop of London, implementing a ban on printed books and booksellers, and you had to obtain, ecclesiastical permission to print anything. And for the next 5 years, there was this campaign against, continental reformer books coming to England, and over the years from that sort of period and into, right up to 1531, you've got lists. 30 different publications that are banned in England that are readily available in Europe and on the continent that people in England, in theory, weren't allowed to read. So that's how we get, books going from being large publications to little small pocket Bibles that can fit into a glove or a sleeve, so that people can start to walk around with Bibles or literature that they are wanting to read, but they can be hidden as they're walking around. Whereas like the Great Bible, for example, was this whopping great big thing that had to be put on a special pedestal and chained so that people didn't steal it because they were so expensive, but no one could carry that around. It was so heavy. So the printing of different versions of the Bible over this time, they got to be quite small, they got to be medium size, like there was quite a range so that people could conceal them or have them proudly displayed. When I was researching some of this, just as an aside, not directly related to this, but it was something very fantastic for me, I was researching the printing things and looked at the original papers in the British Library, and I was just turning the pages over, and then I turned over the next page and there was Anne Boleyn's signature on a letter that she had written in support of the French printers to Cromwell, and I just sat there and went, oh my goodness. So that was pretty exciting. That was one of the really exciting things during my research for my dissertation that I discovered. So if anyone ever wants to get a membership to the British Library, which is free, by the way, and go in there and look for them, it's a fantastic thing.
How exciting. It's such a personal connection, isn't it? And you can make such an emotional connection, I think, with someone from so long ago.
I know, it was incredible. It was sort of like I wasn't really expecting that. I was just sort of turning the pages, having a look, and then bang, I went, oh my goodness.
Amazing. All right. So let's talk a little bit about William Tyndale. You mentioned him before. So there's probably another name that people have heard of a lot. So what was his role in the Reformation? So
if you pick up a copy of the King James Bible today, about 80% of what you read was translated in the 16th century by Tyndale. Much has been written about the distribution of the vernacular English Bible in England during this period, and most of that has centred on Tyndale's contribution because it was extensive, and rightly so. He was a master at his craft. He was the first to translate the New Testament of the Bible from the original Greek and Hebrew into English. So he didn't look at the Latin versions. He actually went back to what we have as the original sources and translated for that. But I think one of the most fascinating things about him that I discovered during my research was just the things that we have in the words and the sayings we have in our everyday lives that he created during his translations that people would just not think of, like words like Passover and congregation were created by him. We've got everyday sayings that were invented by him, things like see the writing on the wall, cast the first stone, salt of the earth, fight the good fight, broken-hearted, the powers that be, blind leading the blind. I can go on, but there's, my brother's keeper, let there be light. The spirit is willing, the flesh is weak, sign of the times, all of those things, all of those sayings, all of those words and the string of those words were written by Tyndale. And like Luther, when they did their translations, they wanted it to sound good when it was read aloud. And, at several points in history, he was, one of the most hated men in England. And he was pursued and hunted down. And because they really, at that time, they really didn't want a full translation of the Bible in English. In the prologue to his 1525 translation, he wrote that he never wanted to intentionally alter or misrepresent the Bible in any way. He just wanted it to interpret the sense of the spirit of the scripture and the meaning of the spirit. And that was, one of the quotes he put in there. But eventually he was tricked by an Englishman, and Henry Phillips, and he was given up to authorities. And ultimately he was strangled and burned in the autumn of 1536, which was, after being in prison, which was really quite sad. I mean, fortunately, he'd managed by that time to completely revise his New Testament, and that's what we see extensively in the King James Version today. And he also did the first 5 books of the Old Testament, so the Pentateuch. I think we could do a whole podcast on Tyndale and his role in that. But, it was, we'll talk in a minute about, some of the dangers that they faced. You certainly had to be committed to the cause, so to speak, of what you wanted to do. And he was certainly hell-bent on translating the Bible because he wanted the everyday English person to read it.
Yeah, and that is a tragic end. And I think if anyone kind of has a look through the state papers of 1535 and early 1536, there are a lot of letters back and forth to England, to Cromwell, especially kind of in his, I'm pretty sure in one of his remembrances, he's like, what are we going to do about this guy, basically? As you mentioned, of course, Anne Boleyn, she thought there should be a Bible in the vernacular. So yes, it was a very tricky line to walk with Henry, that no one ever knew exactly what he was thinking or what he wanted. So yeah, really dangerous. But we are going to talk about that in a moment. I wanted to read you, Michelle, an extract from a paper that Professor Eric Ives wrote, if you don't mind, and then I just want you to comment on it. So he said that reform was a posture rather than a position, and we are moreover dealing very largely with the commitment, belief, and understanding of specific individuals, not with abstract or collective propositions at this time. So the term reform can only indicate a taxonomy of issues and positions on which individuals took or did not take individual stands. So stands which shifted from time to time, one way and the other. One has only to look at Thomas Cranmer to be aware of that. So this fluidity was still further accentuated because the thinking of the continental reformers was itself continuing to evolve. Thus, it is wholly premature, according to Ives, to attempt to describe early reform in England in terms of coherent creedal positions. The reformers themselves would have been hard put to agree on any comprehensive confession of faith. I found this particular passage really interesting. Do you agree with his comments? And can you tell us a little bit about some of those individual beliefs that fueled and encouraged the early reformers in England?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. As I sort of talked about earlier, the people were developing their ideas, some quicker than others. But, it was certainly a dangerous time as well to have these ideas. The prevailing wisdom at the time often changed. Like one day you could be having a discussion with someone about Luther or whatever, and which was okay. You thought it was a pretty good and an active discussion. The next day someone knocks on your door and you get arrested because that person's reported you to the authorities or whatever. So, there's many instances during that time of, particularly on the continent, reformers grabbing the print run of their pamphlets, or in Tyndale's case, the first pages of the Bible off of the printing press in Cologne. He runs out the back door, grabs a boat to Worms, and he has to hide until it's time he has to lay low for a while. And then when the authorities have stopped looking for him or have given up, he sort of then started again with a new printer, and the whole process has sort of started over again. That in an environment like that, people were changing their ideas all of the time. As an aside, those pages that Tyndale did grab off that Cologne press are now known as the Cologne fragments, and they're in the British Library. If people go in, you can actually have a look at those. So when you're visiting, it's a good thing to have a look at. But, Initially, Luther didn't get into that much trouble until after he was asked to recant his ideas, and he wouldn't. Like, up until that point, it was sort of like, oh, come on, like, yes, we know there's a few problems, but how about modifying your ways or whatever? And then after the diet in Worms, he was said, well, you have, he was told that he needed to recant, and he said, well, I'm not going to do that. But, during that period, changing your name or living in a new town under a different name was pretty common. Clandestine meetings with supporters, and it was normal, I think, for them to live in fear, in a state of fear somewhat some of the time, if they were going to have the courage of their convictions or their beliefs. There were hotly debated topics, and indulgences, like as we talked about before, were particularly, one of them. The idea of having a vernacular Bible that lay people could read and discover the Word of God for themselves was fundamental to the progress of the reforms. But also it was one of the things that the Catholic Church and its supporters were most hotly against. I mean, until that time, the majority of Bibles were in Latin, although there were some, German translations before Luther, even some vernacular ones, but not in English. But only educated priests in those days could read Latin. Or educated people as well, but they didn't really have access to the Bible. It was really what the doctrine of the Catholic Church was, that the priest told you in his sermon what it was that you needed to think. And that was really the only way you heard what God wanted you to know. But as people started having access to God's word directly, they realised that not everyone's interpretation of that word was the same. So by having a text in front of you, it allowed people to think for themselves, to see God's word for themselves and say, well, how does this apply to my life? And that was a really powerful thing. I think that things we can't imagine now, and take for granted were new experiences for them. A really interesting thing to come out of that at the time was that people wanted to learn to read. So, you've got cases where there was a head of a household or a head of a village, usually male. He could either read or read a bit, or decided to learn to read so that he could read the Bible to his family and to his neighbours. You see some woodcuts and images of people sitting around on the floor with someone on a chair holding a book, which was obviously the Bible, and reading it to people. And so at this time we see literacy rates start to rise, and it was all because people wanted to be able to read the Bible themselves in English, because they were printed thus rather than being in Latin. But, as with most things, these sorts of things, there's a number of controversies that surrounded it at the time. Tyndale and George Joy had a famous stouch carried out over in print over the translation of the word resurrection. Tyndale wanted the word from the Greek and the Hebrew as resurrection, whereas Joy was doing a revision of some of Tyndale's work, and he wrote life after this. Tyndale objected. So the two of them carried out this stouch quite publicly in the prologues or epilogues of future editions of the translations over a period of a couple of years, where they sort of said, well, he said this, and he said that about me, and whatever. And it was certainly a very public splat, and it really got quite nasty. But ultimately Tyndale is the one that we know and remember, and he destroyed Joy's reputation for centuries because of it. But so that's how print was used as well in those types of things. What is clear from the exchange of those two is that exiled reformers didn't always agree with each other. And that's what I was talking about. These were the people that were actually translating things and interpreting for the rest of us, but their messages and how they conveyed that to the reading public were certainly different. We don't have time now to discuss the whole transubstantiation debate. Luther thought that, that Christ was actually present in the Eucharist, and there was a big, hoo-ha, I suppose you could say, over that stuff. And even today, Catholics and Anglicans and Lutherans think quite differently about it. I mean, what I think is important to remember too is that when there were disputes or when there were changing ideas at this time, these men turned to print to discuss that with people. The level of animosity and the debate that was channeled through these works advocated the Protestant cause, assisted the Catholic cause as well. So both sides used it during this time. And I don't think that, and I'm not the only scholar, I don't think that without print at that time, the level and the speed at which that happened would have been able to to advance, because it's so hard now, because we can just go down the road and, pick up a book or buy a newspaper or even, read something on the internet. So we don't understand at that time, someone printing something off of a press and coming to a group and saying, oh, hey, have a read of this, was just an incredible thing because it was so new. The English exiled reformers on the continent had an avenue in which they could publish their work. So people at home heard about them. And they were also able to challenge the things that in the early days, Henry's court and Henry himself, the polemic, that they were spreading around, they could actually argue against that or debate that in a very public way.
Yeah, I always feel so sorry for the everyday person, I think, at this point, because I just think it was just so confusing knowing what was right, what was permitted, what wasn't. I think at some point, I don't know if it was 1534 or 1535, Cranmer basically says, look, we're just not going to talk about these issues because they're too controversial. So you're not allowed, including pilgrimages and worshipping saints and all that sort of thing. So I think he sort of said, no one's going to be preaching about them. But of course, then everyone was still preaching about them, So it's like, why it's hard to kind of get your head around what people are thinking at this time when you're trying to understand what it is they wanted, because of these changes and how fluid it all was.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really, we talked before, it's a really dangerous time. Men such as Coverdale and, John Rogers, Robert Barnes, Simon Fish, they sought refuge abroad because they were forced to flee persecution. George Joy's beliefs, caused him trouble with authorities in England, even as early as 1526. His rooms were raided. He was suspected of having heretical and prohibited literature. And even a year later, he had to appear before Wolsey because the Bishop of Lincoln said he held heretical and suspect opinions. You couldn't even think aloud, I think, in those days. And it was really tricky. By mid-1539, Henry, he'd been wavering between the old faith and the new reformist ideas. He changed his mind. And when the Act of the Six Articles were brought in, Coverdale had to flee England and go to the continent. He couldn't return and didn't return until the reign of Edward the Sixth. So, it was really dangerous. And he was doing things that they wanted him to do on any particular given day. And suddenly, oh, no, that's not today's thinking. Today's thinking is X, and now you're in trouble. But the printing press was really used at this time for the English doctrinal disputes, whereas in the continent, they may have, got together and had discussions like the Diet of Worms, for example, where they could debate, okay, well, this person thinks this and I argue against this. And they sort of had a bit of an open exchange, even though ultimately, the people who were on the wrong side of the debate ended up being in trouble and still, were persecuted or had to flee or whatever. But at least they had that. But in England, they didn't have that. Yeah, and then, of course, that meant it went a lot longer as well, because obviously you've got to write your thing, then you have to get it printed, and then it's got to be distributed, and then someone's got to go, oh, hang on, so it could be 6 months or a year between things. Certainly Thomas More and Tyndale had a very famous back and forth discussion about those things.
Yeah, I was going to say those the arguments that people were having via print are always quite interesting, and as you say, the period in between to get everything written and all the rebuttals, and so it's fascinating, because now people would just jump on Twitter, wouldn't they? And you'd be like, just tweet something about the other person.
So we're no keyboard warriors in those days.
The last question I want to ask you, Michelle, is in your research and during all the work that you've done, how could you summarize for us, this is a tricky question, I know, how could you summarize for us Henry's attitude to the Reformation?
Well, his attitude certainly is an interesting one, isn't it? And he certainly changes, appears to be going back and forth. And I think some of that is depending on who was sort of in favour at the time, who had the king's ear, so to speak, and also the motives of what Henry wanted at any given moment. Historian George Bernard's book, The King's Reformation, which is a very thick, heavy doorstopper kind of book. So obviously George thought that there was a lot to write about in terms of Henry's ideas on the subject. And he'd certainly have us believe that he played a major role in what occurred in England at the time. But I don't think it's really as simple as that, because it's, the king wanted an heir, and he was married to a woman for 20 years that hadn't given him one, that lived longer than a few months. And the simpleness of people saying, oh, well, the treasury was empty, so the dissolution of the monasteries was, something that that enabled the coffers to be full again, and that's why he thought it was a good idea. And I think it's a really complex, and it's a bit more of a mixture of that. As I said before, travelers and scholars, they went back and forth between the courts, and in doing so they listened to the various different views and they brought them back, and that all had an impact on Henry's court. And there's quite a large amount of correspondence in the papers that show us these exchanges. So despite the fact that England was separated physically from the continent, I think that the ideas and the discussions around all of this at the time certainly was quite influential on the people, on the king and the people around him. I mean, there's no doubt that Henry remained a practicing Catholic right up until his death. So even though his belief in purgatory was waning around sort of that 1538 period, he still hedged his bets a bit, like he refused to abolish clerical and monastic celibacy. And in his last will and testament, he allocated money for injunctions to pray for his soul and for priests to give a sermon at St. George's, Windsor every Sunday on his behalf, although he never did pilgrimage very much. I think he went on one pilgrimage quite early. Catherine was really the one that believed in the pilgrimages, and compared to previous monarchs, and I know there's whole books about this, just this particular topic had been written, but he didn't do that like his father and some of the other monarchs before him. I think that this is sort of drawn out a bit too from him being quite a humanist prince, and Erasmus's teachings and the exposure that he had to those sorts of things. Certainly Henry has been described by one historian as, Catholicism without the Pope. He enjoyed not sending the money to Rome and having the riches in his own coffers. And by breaking away from the church, he was able to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. And he was certainly more open to, I think, the reformist ideas during Anne's tenure with him. But I think deep down he always remained a large part Catholic. Perhaps if he had been granted the divorce from Catherine, things in England would be very different today. I don't think it's not a 25 words or less answer.
No, it's a very tricky question.
There are people that study their whole careers just on this one topic. So I don't feel as if I'm eminently qualified to have a definitive answer either way.
No, I think that was a really good response. And I think it's important to note, as you said, that he died a practicing Catholic. I think sometimes there's a little bit of confusion because of the ideas that were around at the time. But no, he was quite conservative most of his life, I think. Thank you so much. Now, at the end of our episodes, Michelle, we do a little game of 10 to go. So these are 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So first one, and I know you've just moved, but what is something you love about where you're living now?
So we live in a village now. So I've moved from Australia, Melbourne, and we've moved back to the UK, and we live in a village now called Wallingford. And so it's sort of halfway between Reading and Oxford. And I walked into the village yesterday to go to the post office, and I hadn't been before. It was a very big step, going into the village and going to the post office. And there's a market square, and it's quite pretty. It's certainly not a Castle Combe type village, but it's quite a pretty village. And I came out of the post office and looked down the high street towards the market square and just took this sort of deep breath in and a long exhale and just thought, oh my goodness, I'm living in a village in England. And yeah, it's kind of all my dreams come true, really.
And what's a new skill that you'd like to learn?
Well, I play piano badly. I'd probably like to do that better. During Melbourne's second lockdown last year, I started doing online lessons with my son's piano teacher. And so that was good. So so that while it's not a new skill, I'm certainly not very good at it. So I'd like to improve my piano skill. When our piano arrives in our shipping container, I'll be able to start again.
Are you known for a signature recipe?
Yes, I am. I do my grandmother's tuna mornay, which is tuna casserole. It's in different states in Australia. It's called something else. But I also do a very mean chicken and leek risotto that the kids love.
And what about a person, and it doesn't have to be somebody living now, but just somebody that inspires you or has inspired you, and why?
When my parents took me to England and Europe in 1977, when I was 10 years old, I fell in love with Elizabeth I, and from that belief that women could do and be anything despite the naysayers. Although I'm not besotted with Elizabeth like some historians are, I have always gained inspiration and courage from what she did.
Obviously, you've done a lot of study and now you've moved to a new country. So what do you do when you want to relax and unwind?
So I do scrapbooking. So I've marked out a corner in our new conservatory, and the tables and the shelves are waiting for my boxes to arrive. My husband will laugh and tell you about 15 of the boxes in the containers are craft related, which he wasn't that happy about at the time he was packing the container. But so I do that. And then if I'm a bit stressed, I tend to put on either Downton Abbey or The West Wing, which I've watched more times than I can count. West Wing over 20, Downton Abbey at least 10.
Wow. Do you know I haven't watched West Wing, so I definitely have watched Downton Abbey, but not West. So I have to add that to my list now. I'm making a note.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, you will love it.
Oh, good. Excellent. I'm excited now. All right. And what about movies? What genre of movies do you like? For example, do you like scary movies?
Oh, no. No, can't do horror at all. I'd have to sleep with the light on. Actually, I'd probably never sleep again if I watched horror movies. I'm a bit of a 70s tragic. So, Saturday Night Fever, Grease, Ghost, the 80s, probably romance. We like to watch Notting Hill or, Four Weddings and a Funeral, all those sort of things. It's not that I particularly love Hugh Grant, but he sort of made quite a few good movies in the 80s that I really love. And if I'm, it's really funny because we always fall back to, let's watch something. And then we always end up watching something we've already watched
the same
before.
Thing, yeah.
And it's those sorts of movies that, are the ones that I like to rewatch.
And do you have, maybe not at the moment, any pets?
We don't. We are thinking about getting another dog, but in Australia we have a cavoodle called Henry. And he's with my parents. And when we moved here for 2 years in 2017 to 19, he stayed with them and they didn't want to hand him back to us. But we were very grateful to have him for the 2 years we were home again, and he's back there with them now. So we love him very much. He's 9 now. He's a beautiful, placid, cuddly dog, as cavoodle-y type dogs tend to be. And we're thinking we'll get probably another one. They call them cavapoos here. There's a different.
Okay.
They're not called cavoodles here.
Well, funny because I actually have a cavoodle as well. But funny that yours is placid. Mine is completely opposite. So he must have more poodle, I imagine, because even today's been quite kooky. And he's turning, what is he turning? He's turning 8, Lockie. We called him Lockie because he was born on the day that we were in Loch Ness. We were visiting the UK.
Oh.
So we thought we called him Lockie. But we've been waiting for him to mellow, thinking, okay, he's not mellowing, naughty Lockie. So you're lucky.
So Henry was the runt of the litter.
Right.
So when we picked him, he was hiding in the back. Oh. And so we went, that one.
That's the one. Good choice. And what's your favorite form of exercise or activity?
Yoga. And I do a lot of meditation. I do a meditation group every Monday, which was 7:45 in Melbourne time, PM on a Monday. And now I do it at 10:45 in the morning.
Oh, wow. So you still do it, and you're doing it via Zoom or something?
Yeah,
that's
do it
fantastic.
via Zoom.
What's a subject that you wish you knew a little bit more about, something you're interested in learning more?
Look, I don't think my learning of the Reformation's finished. And certainly I've started to look at the Dutch printing industry and the development of that. Andrew Pettigrew has a really good book about that, which is in the container that I haven't been able to read yet. But I think that I will probably start to do a bit more looking at that. It's kind of really fascinating. We went to Planton's museum, and it was just the most fascinating thing. So I don't know, it's a bit weird, probably. Printing presses and typefaces and stuff like that, but I actually find it really interesting.
Awesome, fantastic. And the very final thing is that I ask my guests for a Tudor takeaway. So this is something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a Tudor takeaway for us?
I do. If you're coming to the UK on a holiday, you can get an English Heritage Overseas Visitors Pass. So, or a membership if you live here, depending on who's listening. You know, the money goes towards the upkeep of all the magnificent places, and they've been hit really, really hard by COVID shutdowns. So if you do that, you can really assist them, which is great. And no, I don't get paid to say that. But, you know, like you can visit so many places in addition to the big tourist sites, you know, things like Kenilworth Castle, Elizabeth I's home, Revo Abbey, one of the most significant examples of religious splendour from this period, and one of the most intact ruins in Yorkshire, if not the whole country. But, you know, there's literally dozens and dozens of ruined monasteries around that were destroyed during Henry's reign that you can go and see. But if you're not visiting anytime soon, then you can't do that. I have a more scholastic one if you'd like me to tell people about that. There's a website called luminarium.org. So it's www.luminarium.org. They've got a really large volume of 16th century literature arranged by topics and subject. And they have a really huge history section. It goes from medieval through the Civil War up to the Restoration, but there's a really big Tudor dynasty section, and like you can pick people and they have information about particular people as well. So that I always found that really interesting.
They're both fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll put links to those in our show notes so everyone can
I'll
find
send
them
it
nice
to you properly.
Yeah, all good. I'm good at remembering websites now after all this. And thank you so much, Michelle, for taking the time to talk Tudors with us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.